My man and I finally watched Sinners, and I swear since watching it, new pieces and layers pop up. Like, I could probably watch this movie 3 times and still be picking up on layers. And one thing that was very interesting to me about the movie was the specificity of the Irish being the devil instead of a broader, more American white stereotype, because it clearly takes place in America. And it triggered a memory I had forgotten that I wrote one of my first term papers on Black Americans replacing the Irish as the bottom of the rung. And I went digging to see if I still had that paper, and I found it. And to my surprise, I did. And I forgot this is the paper that I sent as a writing sample with my PhD application forever ago. And I was like, oh God, how bad is this going to be? Because when I tell y'all, I was so clueless about race. Like, I know you're like, duh, you're white. But like, when I tell you my family was so Republican and deep South that we had a moose ornament on our Christmas tree to honor Sarah Palin, I'm not joking. And reading this, while I definitely have some embarrassing moments, I also felt like as much as a lot of me I perceive has changed, how much has not. And I just wanted to share in case it hits someone who is afraid of learning and afraid that they won't be who they are. Because for much of my early adulthood, I felt like I had changed so much and wasn't who I was raised to be, and like felt very disconnected from that. And now I'm at the point in my life where I'm like, no, I didn't really change. So if you're feeling that way, this is for you. And let's learn something a little nerdy behind Sinners. So I called this The Scourge of African Stereotypes, an analysis of the United States media and its prejudice. And I chose this because I was in an honors class on African culture, I think it was. It was so long ago. And they made us write one about the African experience in America. And I was a journalism major, so I thought this would be an appropriate topic. Okay, here it goes. Aristotle proclaimed that the arousing of prejudice, pity, anger, and similar emotions has nothing to do with the essential facts, but is merely a personal appeal to the man who is judging the case, which proves that preconceptions have been a problem for centuries. This is extremely evident when one considers the racial bigotries that have accumulated in the United States alone. A group that has endured a vast amount of these prejudices is the descendants of Africans. While most people are aware that this group suffered enslavement, many do not understand when and why this institution was established. When one delves into the history, it becomes palpable that racism was an economic strategy that was supported by the media. Many of the cartoons from the times reiterated the misconceptions concerning Africans, which prompted whites to remain segregated from them. Thus, these cartoons have controlled Americans' judgments because they brought Africans to the same level of hatred as the Irish, justified their enslavement, degraded them as human beings, promoted their abolition, and are still relevant today. I will give a caveat. I will show pictures of these cartoons, and all of them are derogatory. So trigger warning there. That is literally what the paper is about. So I apologize if it's offensive. That is the point. A common misunderstanding about Africans is that they were always seen as inferior. This notion is further misrepresented by the idea that they were discriminated against because of their dark skin tone. Surprisingly, Africans were generally accepted into the British colonies. People of all colors worked side by side, and Africans were not considered savage. In fact, they were tremendously well cultured because many had been exposed to European principles, especially those in Spain and Portugal. That's one of the cringe parts. Well cultured because they've been around Europeans. Growth, I hope. Edmund Morgan asserts that the colonies were not prejudiced against Africans because, quote, there is more than a little evidence that Virginians during these years were ready to think of N-words as members of the community and to demand of them the same standards of behavior, end quote. Intermarriage was not only allowed but even acceptable. Thus, it is obvious that Africans were first welcomed in the New World, and the illustrations of the time do not show any signs of degrading them. Honestly, the first ethnic group to be heavily stereotyped in colonial America was the Irish. Even until 1867, the notable cartoonist Thomas Nast drew this stereotype in his cartoon St. Patrick's Day. 7. Rum Blood, the Day We Celebrate. This cartoon is offensive because it portrays the Irish as drunken, rowdy animals since they are unruly and appear to be apes. Because they are beating the policemen, it can also be implied that they do not abide by the laws. Even though Irish immigrants were stereotyped, immigration was essential for the colonial economy, since it flourished on indentured servitude. In fact, Jacqueline Jones claims that this form of labor was so instrumental that, quote, indentured servitude furnished the bulk of labor until slavery began to dominate, end quote. However, this system's failure is what led to prejudice towards Africans. When the price of tobacco began to diminish, plantation owners were not always able to reimburse their indentured servants at the time of their contract. Unfortunately, many of the servants were then required to return to indentured servitude regardless of color. Condemned to this unintended form of slavery, colonists were eventually led by Nathaniel Bacon to revolt against their English authority in 1675. Although this revolt was suppressed in 1676, the government realized that they needed a new form of labor. This is hilarious because I talk about this rebellion all the time as the invention of race and the beginning of our class system in the United States. I forgot that I knew this when I was 18. I probably learned it writing this paper. Between the end of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century, colonial rulers began to pass laws to accept racial slavery. Even though the British reviled the Irish, the leaders decided that Africans would be best to discriminate against, since they could be considered heathens because they were neither European nor Christian. Additionally, the Europeans wanted Africans to be the labor source because they were actually considered, quote, civilized and docile people who had knowledge of and experience with tropical cultivation, end quote. Africans knew how to work well together and cultivate crops that were prolific in the colonies but unknown to Europeans. It's funny because in my research I've looked at interdependence versus independence. And they noticed the teamwork among Africans. Mm, 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 mm. Africans also possessed skills that the Europeans envied since they had experience in carpentry, cattle keeping, brick making, weaving, etc. Furthermore, Africans were preferred over the Irish because they were not as susceptible to disease and were deemed more civilized. However, in order to persuade society to accept the enslavement of Africans, the leaders had to separate them from the rest of the races. Thus, the white race category was invented, which included European ethnicities, even the Irish. In order to promote the differentiation, the colonial rulers promoted the idea of the N-word, and by the end of the 18th century, the idea became an ingrained stereotype. I perceive that the Irish went along with this. The Irish in America is why they were the villains in Sinners movie. Not that the other white folks weren't, but why were Irish being seen as becoming the vampires? This is what this took me back to. All right, next horrible cartoon. Justify the enslavement of Africans. Since there was already hatred towards the Irish, Africans had to be portrayed as equally inferior in order to continue the practice of enslavement. For instance, another Harper's Weekly cartoon personifies this change by showing an African and an Irishman being weighed equally on a scale. Weighing them promoted the idea that the Africans were of equal social and political status as the Irish. Additionally, both are caricatured as apes, which promoted the idea that they are subhuman. As intended, Africans sank to the same low status as the Irish, and the cartoon A King of Shanty plainly expressed it. Since the Ashanti was a tribe in Africa and a shanty was an Irish word for a poor man's house, the title of this piece is in itself an insult to both cultures. The shack that the couple is living in mocks the low social status and poverty that Irishmen and Africans endured. The man and woman in the picture are again drawn as apes, which categorize both cultures as primitive and uncivilized. Without a doubt, Africans were forced into being portrayed as subhuman as the Irish, and the media's malicious propaganda encouraged this change. I loved a thesaurus back in the day. In addition to degrading Africans to the same level as the Irish, the cartoons also justified their enslavement. Brian Edwards accomplished this in one of his cartoons by trivializing slavery. Slavery was rather efficient for the colonial economy since owners had free labor after the initial purchase and barely keeping them alive, but I didn't put that in there. In order to keep it firmly established, the institution was not depicted as vile, so it would be more acceptable and easier to force the Africans into and to keep people from rebelling. In 1797, Brian Edwards drew a N-word festival drawn from nature and the island of St. Vincent, in title, which shows enslaved people, I said slaves, dancing, playing music, eating a variety of fruits, and wearing rich garments. According to Edwards' drawings, enslaved Africans reveled in a life of blissful leisure. Therefore, the pictures of the time illustrate that the African was stereotyped as enjoying and belonging in slavery. Negative stereotypes of Africans not only justified their enslavement, but also degraded them as human beings. Nichols explains that these stereotypes humiliated Africans by criticizing and misrepresenting their appearance and dialect. Since they needed to be thought of as savages, Africans, especially the males, were depicted as, quote, comically grotesque with large lips and teeth, woolly hair, a wide nose, and big feet with an elongated heel, end quote. Consequently, these cartoons promoted the idea that Africans were less human than, quote, whites, because they did not appear human in these cartoons. Even so, savagely illustrating them was not enough. Nichols narrated that Africans were also pictured as having, quote, a way of speaking that included comic malapropisms, odd speech, and above all, a dialect, a simplistic inventory of bad grammar and peculiar pronunciations, end quote. This diction was often represented through songs, speeches, and sermons that were either published in newspapers or performed on stage. As a result, the Africans were dehumanized because they were portrayed as grotesque and unintelligent. A specific example of how Africans were degraded would be Thomas Carlyle's Cashie's Dream of Emancipation. These pictures were supposed to be humorous because they portrayed the racist beliefs that Africans were indolent, unintelligent, and barbaric. In his pamphlet, Occasional Discourse on the N-Word Question, Carlyle was emphatic that he believed that Africans were lazy and uncivilized, which made them, quote, ill-equipped for independence, end quote. His views and those of his time are reflected in his cartoons. The first panel depicts the stereotype of the lazy slave. While the white master is illustrated wielding a hoe, the Africans are carrying instruments and dancing gleefully. Knowles claims that this is significant Knowles claims that it is significant that one of the slaves has a banjo, since the instrument was particularly useful to illustrate someone who was lazy and carefree. Further, this cartoon infested viewers with the idea that Africans were not affected by the cruelty they endured as slaves. Carlyle connected his picture to a quote from Thomas Jefferson. I still hate him and flip off the memorial every time I pass it, who stated that, quote, those numberless afflictions are less felt and sooner forgotten with them, end quote. Collectively, this cartoon is an effective representation of African stereotypes because it accused the race of being lazy and oblivious to cruelty, even though this was obviously not the case. Additionally, the second panel shows an African languishing on the floor, drinking alcohol, and reading an abolitionist newspaper, while being served by a beautiful, quote, white woman. The picture is captioned with, quote, he dreams that his young missus humbly waits upon him while he reads the Tribune, end quote. To Carlyle's audience, this notion would have been hysterical, since it was not even fathomable for an African man to marry a white woman. The clear distinction between the two races is depicted by the distinguished differences in dress. While the woman is in clean and sophisticated clothes, the man is grimy, still wearing his hat and coat inside, and even raises his boots to lean on the tablecloth. Evidently, the African was not only thought to be lazy, but also filthy, rude, and too barbaric to even sit in the empty chair. As a consequence, he was undoubtedly undeserving of a beautiful white woman. Carlyle's third panel continues the insults. He depicts a couple of African men in plain suits serving two white women in elaborate dresses and hats. While their careers are not distinguished, Carlyle's caption claims that they are working in the, quote, easy employments of the North, end quote. One of the men leans across a countertop to ogle the women, which Knowles claims further promotes the famous stereotype that African men are attracted to finery and white women. However, as the previous panel reminds viewers, these men are clearly undeserving of her. The contrasts of the first two panels reveal the low political and social status of Africans and are supposed to be comically ironic. The first one depicts what is supposed to be the dreams of Africans. Thus, the African man is on a stage wearing a splendid suit, and he is being admired by a crowd of white men, one of which is kissing his hand. The caption asserts that he is ready to, quote, stand for Congress. In the lower panel, two African men are dressed in fine suits in a, quote, stage box at Wallack's Theater, end quote, and one is leaning out with binoculars, apparently trying to obtain a better view of the performance. A glimpse of a few white women is given in the lower left-hand corner. Both of these panels echo the political and social status of Africans in America. The thought of them attaining high enough political status to be a congressman or enough social status to attend a theatrical performance is not only disregarded but also comical. Sadly, the true status of the African is shown in the last panel on the right. An African is strapped to a post and is beaten by his white master. Obviously, a race that requires whippings to be controlled would not be welcome in a political or social event. Therefore, Carlyle's cartoon unmistakably personified the African stereotypes that the media inflicted upon the public. Furthermore, Africans were degraded by being portrayed as lazy through the coon stereotype. This depiction promoted the notion that Africans were idle and tried to do the least amount of work possible while still avoiding punishment. Even though records prove that African slaves oftentimes worked from dawn until dusk, many slave owners complained that their work that their workers were languid. However, a plantation overseer from North Carolina claimed that he'd, quote, rather be dead than be an N-word on one of these big plantations, end quote. Nevertheless, society became even more overwhelmed with the impression that slaves were lazy through the modern cartoons. A famous example of the slothful stereotype would be the Zip Coon. Beginning in the 1830s, this character was an African man who put on airs by pretending to be white. Thus, he was drawn in fanciful white clothing and was apparently attempting to imitate whites. Obviously, the African was unaware of how foolish he appeared, but his situation was humorous because there was supposedly no way of being of such low social status could dress so well. Because he was busy playing dress up, this African was clearly avoiding work. Moreover, this cartoon was the cover of sheet music to a racist theatrical performance. In the play, the African also tried to speak like a white man. However, he was obviously ignorant because he often spoke with incorrect diction and used distorted logic, because it's so logical to enslave a group of people, right? Not only did this depict the African as too lazy to learn to speak properly, but he was also slothful since he was busy imitating his master instead of working. Another way that Africans were dishonored through the recurring Mammy themed cartoons. This title is derived from Mama and was used to present an invalid illustration of the African woman as a nanny, portrayed as an older, large, charcoal black, nappy headed woman. The African was depicted as sexually unattractive in every way. Not only was she exploited, she was also denied any credibility of intelligence or opinion. Regardless, she was drawn as if she loved her job. Always pictured as a house servant, these cartoons convinced people that African women had no ambitions outside of serving quote unquote white families in their homes. Consequently, this led to the common expectation that African women were only useful for cooking, cleaning, and laundry, which denied them access to individual careers in any other field. Without a doubt, these stereotypes were tremendously harmful to society's perceptions of Africans since they limited the business opportunities of their women. Furthermore, the mammy was always pictured as being in the service of a wealthy white family, particularly the husband. Clearly, these cartoon characters encouraged the budding notion that Africans were subhuman to the white man. Since she was also portrayed as a maternal figure, she was constantly illustrated as absolving problems within the white families. Even though being considered a peacemaker is an admirable trait, this scenario was meant to be demeaning because it fostered the notion that Africans were intended to take care of white families and their problems. She was also depicted as stupid because of her poor use of grammar. Without a doubt, these caricatures were nothing more than a wealth of artistic lies. I loved some dramatic language back in the day. Artistic lies. Mammies were generally quite young and attractive, which made sexual abuse from their white masters unfortunately common. Regrettably, these stereotypes were the cause of African women's difficulty to learn any other trade outside of raising children and housekeeping, since this persona fooled so many employers into believing that she was not only useful for any other type of work. Obviously, the Mammy cartoons have been extremely harmful to the depiction of Africans in general, but especially to the females. I said females. Ugh. Degrading reputations such as these made slavery socially acceptable since the African was perceived as being available for the white man's benefit. The N-word Mammy was published in Harper's Weekly in 1862 and is a prime example of the exploitation that African women have endured from this stereotype. This image depicts a large African woman with another woman beside her and a child at each side of her. Even though she is behind a fence, her arms are open and welcoming. She fits the mammy stereotype, first of all, because she is not conventionally attractive. I just said not attractive. She is a rather large woman, and her facial features are distorted and unappealing. Also, she is obviously not educated because of her use of incorrect diction in the caption. She says, "I's so glad you is come. Massa says he wishes you was in the bottom o' the sea, but you ain't in the bottom of the sea. You is here, and oh, I's so glad to see you." Can you read that on the? That's literally what the words are. Sadly, this woman is noticeably not portrayed as intelligent and is apparently ignorant of her inane state. Furthermore, she is clearly glad to see someone, and even though she implies that her master is cruel since he wishes someone was at the bottom of the sea, she does not seem displeased with him. She does not seem displeased with him. I think I messed up. I had a typo there. Collectively, it is implied that she is satisfied with her position, has no desire for any other ambition. She is also undoubtedly associated with servitude and family, since she is noticeably restrained by the fence, and there are two small children climbing on the fences next to her. Even though these children are not white, they imply that this woman is a maternal figure. Because of her disengaging appearance, unintelligence, lack of ambition, and familial association, this cartoon portrays the label of African women since before and during the Civil War. And I didn't put, but this was also during Jim Crow as well. Fortunately, these humiliating cartoons were finally twisted to promote the abolition of African slavery. Even though Southern playwrights and cartoonists had to employ enough racism to keep the institution justified, they did not want to depict it as comical. Even so, blatant racism was apparently rather popular in the North, even though slavery was not as common up there. Providentially, these undignified and inaccurate depictions actually encouraged the abolitionist. Peace Democrats saw these depictions as an opportunity to raise awareness of the ridiculousness of these personifications. Clearly, these cartoons and plays were not true, and Africans are just as human as white people are. Thus, slaves in these cartoons were drawn with many exaggerations, mostly through the dialect in the captions. Nichols points out that these characteristics are visible in the Rebellion's Support, which was featured in Comic Monthly in January 1862. In this depiction of the typical N-word appearance, abolition is encouraged by illustrating a diminutive rebel soldier in the large African's palm. The dramatic stereotypical emphasis in this depiction makes the slave's dominion over his southern master even more ironic. Literally, this cartoon featured how dependent the white man was on Africans, even though he ridiculed him as a savage. Furthermore, Nichols shows the abuse of dialect in the papers through an article from Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper from 11th of January 1862. This article mocks the Southern white man's descriptions of African dialect through a reward advertisement. $500 reward runned away from me on the 7th of this month. He talked ver big and used the name of the Lord all of the time. He calls himself Southern gentleman, the article stated. Obviously, this is an offensive misrepresentation of a slave's dialect. However, it was actually used as an insult to slave masters, describing how a slave would mimic his master by speaking arrogantly and using the Lord's name in vain. This article is actually showing how uncivilized these Southern gentlemen truly were. Since the article is written in the stereotypical language, it illustrates how the master is actually the savage. Thus, even though racist cartoons were initially used to promote Africans as inferior beings, they eventually helped some citizens notice the injustice of the system and ended up aiding the abolitionist movement. Not only were the white Americans beginning to insist on abolition, but the African community began to compose their own press. I don't know about white Americans insisting on abolition. There were some, but clearly not all. In 1827, Freedom's Journal was published by two free-born African Americans, John Russwurm and Samuel Cornish. This newspaper was written specifically for Africans and undoubtedly did not allow for the racial slurs that were prevalent in other papers. Parton claims, quote, editorials deriding slavery, racial discrimination, and other injustices against African Americans were aimed at providing a counterweight to many of the white newspapers of the time, which openly supported slavery and racial bias. Instead, this newspaper contained all of the news, editorials, biographies, births, and deaths that were relative to the African community in the United States. Furthermore, when one looks at an illustration of the co-editor Russwurm, the difference in how the African American is drawn is striking. He is in no way similar to an ape, nor is he unintelligent or slavish. Rather, he appears quite human and even sophisticated. Encouraging further progress, this paper created a sense of community for the Africans since it gave them a place to express their difficulties and ideas to make a change. Equally as important, the newspaper was also intended to promote literacy and education among Africans, but this attempt was greatly fought by the, quote, white Americans. Reading a newspaper also made Africans more aware of global events, which connected them to other African communities both in other regions of the United States and abroad. Without a doubt, this newspaper was an incredible attempt to combat the prejudice media. Unfortunately, this newspaper was not able to stay in circulation past 1829, and the competition from intolerant papers was monumental. Nevertheless, by the dawn of the Civil War, there were over 40 African American newspapers fighting against bias in the United States. While it is uplifting that the media stereotypes were twisted to aid abolition, it is disturbing that the modern media in the United States still portrays African descendants with prejudice. Dennis Rome asserts, quote, the news media, for example, have taken the lead in equating young African American males with aggressiveness, lawlessness, and violence, end quote. Even though it has become statistically proven that white males use cocaine more than black males, Rome points out that the media has built a facade emphasizing that African men can only make a living through illegal activity. Thus, deceitful, misleading, and insulting stereotypes of Africans are still portrayed in the United States media. For example, Rome accounts one white woman who was published in the news for supposed carjacking. In the story, the news posted an image of a dark-skinned man in a skull cap, which implied that this man was the criminal responsible for this devastation. However, upon further investigation, it was discovered that the mother had actually buckled her own infants in the car and plunged into a lake. Of course, the story is extremely tragic because of the maternal betrayal and infanticide, but it is also devastating because of the stereotype that it promoted. An African man had nothing to do with this situation. As far as the public knows, there were no Africans or their descendants involved at all. Thus, this example is evidence that the stereotypes concocted to enslave Africans are still prevalent. Rome believes that these prejudgments are destructive to the African American psyche since the children and teenagers are surrounded by bias. Consequently, they feel doomed to participate in these negative lifestyles that the media portrays as expected of African descendants. Therefore, Rome believes that these stereotypes are still effective since they damage the African reputation, which promotes negative attention. However, these issues are quite possibly becoming harmful to Americans now. Because they hadn't been the whole time, right? Edward Miguel has visited Africa, Edward Miguel has visited Africa annually since 1997 and claims that he has seen remarkable speed in Africa's progress. He recounts, quote, economic growth rates are at historic highs and democratization appears to finally be taking root, end quote. Africa is becoming an essential part of global trade, and one example is evident in its supply of crude oil. Nigeria, Angola, Chad, Sudan, and Gabon are filling the gaps for the world's lack of oil resources. Miguel also explains that Africa has become a dominant force in global trading and that it exports prices and that its export prices and inflow of foreign capital have remained extremely high. Clearly, Africa is not the savage jungle in each of its countries that many Americans think it is. As a result, the people are undoubtedly not savages either. Without a doubt, there are dishonorable misrepresentations of Africans prevalent throughout the United States. When one studies the history of the colonies and its indentured servitude system, one can begin to fathom why slavery was invented. Because of this understanding, it becomes apparent that Africans were not always resented or accused because of their appearance. Rather, they were enslaved because of the ill-fated planning of indentured servitude and their remarkable work ethic and talents. However, because they were not initially considered savages, the public mind had to be distorted in order to deem them worthy of enslavement. The media was enormously influential in promoting stereotypes which supposedly transformed the African from a worthy human being into a heathen deserving of enslavement. For centuries, these stereotypes plagued the African community in America. God, it was repetitive. Fortunately, they were eventually distorted to promote abolition because their claims were so ridiculous and obviously erroneous. Nevertheless, these negative ideas became so ingrained in the American image of Africans that some of these notions still plague the country today. However, an informed person cannot help but notice Africa's rise in the global economy. Consequently, it is becoming even more vital for the United States media to inform the public of these changes in Africa. Overall, it is evident that stereotypical cartoons have had a tremendous effect on the perception of Africans since they brought them to the same low social status as the Irish, justified their enslavement, degraded them as human beings, promoted their abolition, and continued to pervade the culture's view of Africans today. Oh, you can tell who learned to repeat the thesis statement in the conclusion. All right, and then it's works cited. Well, in typical white girl fashion, it ended with slavery, right? Didn't go on past that. Stopped thinking there for a little while. And it didn't make the connection on for the Irish to be assimilated into white people. They had to choose to be okay with black people replacing them on the bottom of the rung. And as I've talked about in many videos, this is what a lot of people do, even marginalized groups. People do anything to not be at the bottom. we might think that, oh, if someone's been at the bottom, they have empathy for the bottom. Not necessarily. Often, people are looking for who can replace them at the bottom so they can feel better about themselves. This is the same reason why white women have, as a whole, not been supportive of women of color. Still struggle to work together because intersectional is really the only way. Anyway, clearly, still a lot of growth that had to be done. Still a lot of growth that has to be done today. It is just also both amazing how long some things can take and hopeful that who you are and what you value can change over time. But a lot also doesn't change. You just start noticing it more and making different choices. And that's all I got.